The Miami Heat have officially shocked the world. The Heat are coming off an extremely impressive 6-game victory over the New York Knicks in the second round, and they're now advancing to the Eastern Conference Finals. When going into the season, but especially going into the playoffs, nobody expected them to make it out of the first round against the Milwaukee Bucks. But the way the Heat roster was able to come together, hit big shots, and play overall great team basketball was really the driving factor to get the Heat to the point where they're at today. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy Sports. I make opinionated NBA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. I also want to quickly mention that I recently started up an MMA channel, and if you guys are interested in that, the link will be in the description. But anyways, let's get into it. During the regular season this year, the Miami Heat had one of the worst seasons they've had in a pretty long time. They were dealing with a bunch of different injuries to a lot of different guys. They were dealing with the fact that a lot of players they had on the roster that were on the roster to shoot solely weren't shooting nearly as effectively as they should, and they were dealing with a lot of different issues that made the Heat have a really rough regular season. And going into the postseason, the Heat had to make the playoffs through the play-in tournament. And after losing their first game in the play-in tournament and eventually winning their second game, the Heat were then going to be the 8th seed, and their first round matchup was going to be up against the Milwaukee Bucks. And going into that matchup against the Milwaukee Bucks, virtually everybody expected Milwaukee to win. Not only because the 1 seed virtually always beats the 8th seed, basically like 98% of the time, but also when you looked at the Heat, it was pretty clear they weren't playing their best ball this season. But early on into the series, after Giannis got hurt, and then eventually when the Heat found themselves up 3-1, a lot of people at that point thought Miami was going to win that series, but there still was a bunch of fans that thought Milwaukee would regroup and eventually beat the Heat, because a lot of people did still think the Bucks were the better team. But when the Heat were able to win in just 5 games, it was pretty astonishing, because going into that series, not only did basically everybody expect Milwaukee to win, but they expected them to win relatively easily in maybe 4 or 5 games. But the fact that the Heat were able to win in 5 games in basically a gentleman's sweep was just extremely impressive, and basically the complete opposite of what everybody expected. Now, obviously the Giannis injury certainly did play an effect, but Giannis did play a lot of games in that series, and the Heat were still able to win those games. So of course it was still extremely impressive for the Heat to get past the number 1 seed Milwaukee Bucks, who also, by the way, were a team that a lot of people thought would make it out of the Eastern Conference. But going forward to their second round matchup against the New York Knicks, this series was seen as a very competitive one, but at the end of the day, I would definitely say most people thought the Knicks would win that series, just because a lot of people thought the Knicks had the more talent out of those two teams, and although the Heat did a really nice job at beating the number 1 seeded Milwaukee Bucks, the Knicks were just the better team at the end of the day, and the Knicks weren't dealing with injuries, at least all that many injuries, as Julius Randle was only going to miss 1 game at that point. But that series just ended, and the Heat were able to beat the Knicks in only 6 games. And not only were the Heat able to beat New York, they looked very dominant while doing so as well. Their Game 1 victory was relatively close, but the Heat did a great job at winning. Their Game 2 loss even was pretty close, even though they didn't have their best player. And I would say overall throughout the most part of that series, the Heat were just doing a tremendous job at doing what they do best and limiting what the New York Knicks did well. They did a great job at limiting RJ Barrett and Julius Randle, and even Jalen Brunson to an extent. Now, Brunson obviously had a great series, but that's just because he's a special talent. But the Heat did a really nice job at sending 2 or 3 guys at Brunson, forcing him to move the ball a little bit, and they did a really nice job at game planning for New York, and they realized that a lot of other players in the Knicks weren't hitting shots, so it made a lot more sense to double or triple team Brunson, which is something they did very effectively in that series. Now, offensively, the Heat also did a tremendous job at moving the ball really effectively and getting wide open shots for their shooters. Now, even though in certain games the Heat didn't shoot all that well, they did a really nice job at getting wide open looks, and eventually those looks would start to fall, and it seemed like in that series, throughout the entire series, even if the Heat weren't hitting all that much early on, they eventually found a way to hit those big shots in those clutch situations. For example, if the Heat had a decent lead and the Knicks were coming back somewhat, the Heat would eventually hit that 3-point jump shot that turned out to be the dagger, or turned out to be a huge shot in the moment to really stop the Knicks' momentum. And it just seemed like throughout that entire series, whenever the Knicks started to mount something, the Heat always had the answer for them. And at the end of the day, that's why the Heat were able to win that series against the New York Knicks, and now they're moving on to the Eastern Conference Finals, the first number 8 seed to make the Eastern Conference Finals in a very, very long time. And in this matchup, the Heat are either going to go up against the Boston Celtics or the Philadelphia 76ers. As at the time I'm recording this video, it's before that Game 7 happened between those two teams, but if I had to guess at this point, I do think Boston is probably going to win that game, and if it's the Boston Celtics versus the Miami Heat, that'll be a very interesting matchup. Because when you look at the Miami Heat, obviously they shouldn't be at this point. When you look at their roster, they do have Jimmy Butler, who's tremendous, especially in the playoffs. He elevates his game even more, but when you look at the rest of their roster, they definitely have some nice players, but they don't necessarily have the most talented roster in the NBA. And even some of the talent that they had before got injured in the playoffs, like Victor Oladipo and Tyler Hero. So the question at this point is, why are the Heat playing so well, and how do they make it to the Eastern Conference Finals? Well, I think it comes down to a bunch of different factors, but clearly the main factor has to be Erik Spoelstra. Erik Spoelstra has been one of the best coaches in the NBA basically ever since he made it to the league. And the reason why he's such a great coach is he's able to get his teams to buy in each and every season by running great offensive sets while also running great defensive sets as well. And the thing about Spoelstra is not only was he able to win championships when he had a ton of talent on his rosters, like for example when he had LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh, but even when he didn't have the most talent, he's still able to be very successful, and a perfect example of that is this season with the Miami Heat. And I think coaching is something that's somewhat overlooked in the NBA. When you talk about other sports, especially like the NFL, it's pretty clear that coaching has a huge effect on the game. But when you look at the NBA, I don't necessarily think people give coaching enough credit, because I think when you look at the best coaches in the NBA, you see that their teams typically are always one of the best teams in the league, regardless of the talent they have on the roster. And Erik Spoelstra is a perfect example of that, and it really shows how truly important coaching is. And I think as long as the Heat are able to keep Erik Spoelstra as their head coach, I think they're always going to be, at the bare minimum, relatively good. And also at the same time, I do think they have the potential to win championships with this guy, of course, as he has proven the ability to do so in the past. And at this point, going into the Eastern Conference Finals, in my opinion, it's going to be the Boston Celtics, but the Celtics or the Sixers, I do think the Heat are in a relatively good situation. Now, going into that series, either one of those teams, the Sixers or the Celtics, are probably going to be the favorite of that series, and in my personal opinion, I do think one of those teams would beat Miami at this point. But either way, the amount that the Heat were able to accomplish this season was incredible. And going into both other series that the Heat have been in so far, they've also been the underdog, so it doesn't necessarily mean anything if, or really when, the Heat are going to be the underdog against any of those teams that they could possibly go up against in the Eastern Conference Finals. They could once again shock the world and make it to the NBA Finals with the roster they currently have at this point, which would be absolutely incredible considering the talent level they have on the roster, and really would show how great of a coach Erik Spoelstra truly is. But I guess time will tell what does end up happening with the Miami Heat the rest of the season. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the Heat are a special team at this point, and do you think they can make it to the finals, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out guys.